I'd like to talk for a minute about Alexander the Great's campaign in India of 327 BC. Now, his invasion of India was relatively short-lived, about 2 years, and the polities that he established on the northwestern region of India, what is now India, did not dominate the entire subcontinent. Nonetheless, culturally, philosophically, artistically, religiously, the Greeks had a profound impact on Indian culture. And we're going to see how they impacted particularly the development of Buddhism during this period of time. But they also had an outsized political impact with the development of the Mauryan Empire and later the Gupta Empire, which were based in part on Alexander's model. So to begin with, Alexander the Great, the great Macedonian king, I won't go into his background in very much detail. His mother was Olympias. His father was Philip, King Philip of Macedon. King Philip had unified Greece. The Macedonians are kind of the country cousins of the Greeks. King Philip had unified all the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule, and Alexander, when he inherited the throne, he was determined to outdo his father and conquer the vast Persian Empire in what is today, centered in what is today Iran. Right? A good portion of the Persian Empire stretched into the Indian subcontinent, and because of this, in order to complete his conquest, Alexander had to cross the Indus River and venture into India. The Persians had had a very tenuous hold on the small pieces of northwestern India that they controlled. Well, we say small, relatively small compared to the entire subcontinent, but not actually small, the region of Bactria, the Persians controlling all of what is now Afghanistan and a good chunk of what is now Pakistan, all the way to the northwestern borders of India in the Punjab region today. So Alexander had a very professional army of Macedonian soldiers who fought in a phalanx. That's to say, a formation of spearmen, of spear-wielding armored infantry. They had a helmet, a breastplate, and greaves. And they would have a shield and a very long spear. And this formation, the spear formation, was based on solid discipline and experience with marching, so that basically the Macedonians could present the Persians a wall of spears and thoroughly weaken the Persian cavalry. So the Macedonians were able to, under the leadership of Alexander, who had himself had a very powerful cavalry in the form of the companion cavalry, as he called it, Alexander ended up conquering Persia in a very, very short period of time. He dominated Egypt, he conquered Persia, he conquered the Levant, he conquered what's now Turkey, then called Asia Minor, and he marched east and crossed the Indus River in 327 BC. Alexander believed that India was the end of the earth. At this period of time, they did not have an accurate understanding of just how large Eurasia was, just how large Africa was. He believed that on the other side of India, there was a vast ocean that stretched until the edge of the earth. So he wanted to complete his conquest of the known world, and he believed that India was the final destination that he had to overcome. When he, fortunately for Alexander, when he arrived in India, he found a number of disunited small states. Some of them, we say small, some of them had a very large number of subjects relative to the territories that Alexander had encountered thus far. Then, just as now, India was very, very heavily populated, and some of these states could wield very powerful armies. In the case of Alexander's Macedonian army, they had the advantage of professionalism, of very advanced tactics and equipment. But nonetheless, these large armies, some of which had war elephants, were very formidable enemies. And of course, if you know anything about Alexander, we won't go into great detail about him, but this challenge was something he took very seriously and he continually wanted to test himself. So he went into the Hindu Kush, he went into Afghanistan, and would eventually cross the Indus River. When he crossed the Hindu Kush mountains, he encountered the most difficult terrain of his entire military career. These were very remote, very high mountains. The tribes that lived in these mountains were technologically very primitive. They were not very well organized. However, they knew the terrain very well, and they were very much independent-minded. They tended to continually revolt against Persian control up until the point that Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. And so he found a great amount of difficulty in dealing with these tribes as well. In particular, they created several mountaintop fortresses that were very, very difficult for Alexander to take and secure. One of the fortresses that Alexander was hell-bent on conquering was called the Rock of Aornos. You can get an idea of how steep and how difficult the terrain was by looking at this image here of where the rock was located, the Pir Sar mountain in northern Pakistan. Not only is it extraordinarily difficult terrain, the weather is very brutal, it's very cold, the air is relatively thin, which is something that, even though Greece is a very mountainous part of the world, including Macedonia, these mountains are on an entirely different level. So the Macedonian troops had a great deal of difficulty dealing with these sieges. The Rock of Aornos was used by the ancestors of the modern Pashtun people of Pakistan and Afghanistan to defend against the Persian army during their many revolts. According to Alexander's belief, the great Greek hero Hercules failed to take this fortress. It was actually relatively famous far to the west, and because Hercules had failed to take it in Alexander's mind, that meant he had to take it. He had to make good not only for the pride of the Greeks, but he himself had to surpass Hercules. So he had his soldiers build a siege ramp out of timber, earth, rocks, essentially a giant ramp that led up into and you can see the purple ramp here that Alexander's troops had built. And this is what enabled him ultimately to assault the fortress. So he built this giant ramp, he led his army up, and they began to fire catapults and arrows down onto the defenders, forcing them further into the fortress, and eventually they ended up committing suicide, and the fortress fell to Alexander's men, securing his rear as he marched deeper into the region. With his rear and supply line secure, Alexander was able to march all the way to the Hydaspes River solidly into what's now India. He ends up encountering a king, King Porus of Parava, and Porus had the largest army in the region. Most of the kings that Alexander encountered agreed to submit and to pay him tribute, like the great king Taxiles, who realized that Alexander's military, having defeated the Persian Empire, that they were no match for what Alexander was putting into the field. But King Porus attempted to fight him. Porus had a large army of chariots, which in India was still a predominant way of waging war. But he also had a large number of war elephants. And of course, these were very terrifying to the Macedonian foot soldiers, but they actually found a way to defeat them. They would spread their ranks out, and then they would kind of herd the elephants in between lines of men and spear the elephants to death. So they were able to overcome and face down this very difficult challenge. So Porus fought Alexander, fielding a very large army, and was ultimately defeated. We call this battle the Battle of Hydaspes. One of the reasons that Alexander was victorious at Hydaspes was because he was able to get the jump on Porus by crossing the river during the monsoon. Now, this was not only technically very difficult, this was very, very frightening for the Macedonian soldiers who had never encountered something like the monsoon before. In fact, we're going to talk about this more at the end of this video. So Alexander was able to marshal his courage and lead his men. His men trusted him to the point that he was actually able to cross the river and thoroughly defeat Porus after catching him by surprise. According to the Greek historians, Porus made a good account of himself during the battle. So Alexander was impressed by Porus' performance. When he captured Porus, he had expected to execute him. He asked Porus how he felt he should be treated. Porus replied, like a king, essentially refusing to submit to Alexander. So then Alexander offered him his kingdom back if he would in fact submit and become his vassal. And so Porus agreed, and he became an underling of Alexander, who restored him to his throne, and not only that, actually added territory to Porus's kingdom of Parava. So it's kind of a famous part of the political development of Northwestern India.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that
in the future. Don't know why that cut off there. But if you take a look, you can see this coin here, silver coin minted by Alexander. It's got Alexander on one side. It's got Alexander leading his troops against Porus war elephants on the other. This was to commemorate Alexander's great victory over the powerful Indian king. Alexander had won a great success. He wanted to continue deeper into India. There were still many kingdoms with armies just as large as Porus's that Alexander was wanting to test his army against. The problem was that his troops were exhausted. They had followed him all the way from Greece for 11 years. They had been fighting the length and breadth of the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran. They had made it all the way into India, and they were ready to go home. Many of them had acquired fortunes fighting in battle after battle after battle. Many of them had acquired wives among the conquered peoples like the Persians, and they wanted to go back and enjoy the fruits of their labor. They were tired of being on the march. And so they mutinied against Alexander, which was unthinkable because he was the ultimate commander. Yet he had no choice but to back down. On top of this, the monsoon played a major role in shaping Greek attitudes. The Macedonians were Mediterranean people. They were used to a semi-arid climate with very little rain. There was enough for agriculture, but they did not have the kind of torrential storms that existed in India during the monsoon. And so when the monsoon came upon them, they were terrified. The troops were terrified at the Battle of Hydaspes. The fact that Alexander was able to lead them across the river during this traumatic event for them is a testament to his own courage, or maybe even his own hubris. But the monsoon was a sign to many of the troops that it was time to stop. It was time to turn around and go home. The climate, the weather was very, very alien, and they had won great victories. It was time to enjoy them. So Alexander reluctantly agreed. He left some of his generals in charge of his conquests in northern India, and he returned to Persia. The return trip was very difficult, just as the march into India had been very difficult. Part of the army sailed down the Indus River, and they had the easiest time of it. However, those who had to march through the desert would find themselves suffering through very difficult circumstances. When Alexander returned, he ended up passing away in Babylon of typhus. The problem is that he died very young without an heir, and so his empire was split among his generals, and disunity occurred almost immediately after his death. So the regions that he had conquered in India, northwestern India, would develop into what we call the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. There are regions of northwestern India and Afghanistan that would remain dominated by Greek-speaking rulers for several generations. Alexander's domination of northwestern India would be critically important for the entire subcontinent. This is due in part to the fact that Alexander destroyed the most powerful states in northwestern India, which was the most militarily powerful part of the Indian subcontinent. So the fact that he was able to sweep away many of these different rulers paved the way for unification. He's kind of like Napoleon, right? Napoleon, when he conquered Germany, Italy, he destroyed many of the different city-states, which in turn set the stage for the later unification of those countries. The same thing happened in northwestern India. On top of this, he introduced ideas about military discipline and organization that the Indians would later adopt in their own armies. On top of this, you have economic ties that would be established with Persia and with Greece further to the west, and you would have sustained trade between the different Indian states that would develop and the territories further to the west for the first time on a massive scale. And finally, you would have the philosophical and religious ideologies of India change in response to encountering Greek ideas. Alexander justified his conquest with the belief system of Hellenism. He had a duty, according to his teacher, Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history, to spread Greek ideas, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek civilization to different parts of the world. Well, many thinkers in India were very much amenable to receiving a lot of this Greek philosophy, Greek ideology, particularly the teachings of Plato. Plato's belief in an ideal world of forms and the physical world being illusory was very, very much in line with Hinduism and Buddhism. And so, particularly with Buddhism, Buddhist belief and Greek philosophy would fuse together, and they would actually become expressed artistically through Greco-Buddhist art. You can see some examples here. These are all images of Siddhartha Gautama, Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha. But if you notice that there is an emphasis on anatomical correctness and realism, this was something that the Greeks valued in art, representing nature as it was. And this is in line with the teachings of Aristotle. This was not something that was very popular in India before this period of time. Art was largely symbolic. What mattered is what the symbols in the stone represented, right? They didn't represent an accurate portrayal of nature because that wasn't important. But the Greeks introduced this desire to reproduce physical reality. And so these Indian artists adopted that when creating images of the Buddha. And you can see the obvious Greek influence in these statues. On top of this, as I mentioned, Plato's idea of the world of forms would be incredibly influential in shaping Buddhist arguments about samsara, the cycle of rebirth, death, rebirth, and ultimately what nirvana meant, escaping the cycle of rebirth and death. And for many of the Greco-Buddhists who would come later in northwestern India and who would spread Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia, the state of nirvana was akin to the world of forms described by Plato. So this would have an outsized influence on Indian civilization for the next several dynasties. And we're going to talk about these dynasties that came in the wake of Alexander and were inspired by Alexander's achievements. And the rulers, including Chandragupta himself, who may have actually met Alexander, who was inspired to conquer northwestern India on his own and created the Mauryan Empire, the first very powerful Indian state in a considerable amount of time. And we'll start with that video next.